Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to our Politics in the Pub tonight. I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay respect to their elders, both past and present. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. In 2024, the Australia Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary as Australia's leading independent think tank. That's 30 years of big ideas. If you're not in a position to be a monthly donor, we have a Donate Now tap machine at the back of the room. Please speak to one of our friendly staff if you would like to make a donation to support our work. I'd like now to welcome our guest for this evening, Josh Bornstein, lawyer and author of Working for the Brand, How Corporations Are Destroying Free Speech. Josh Bornstein is an award-winning lawyer specialising in employment and labour relations law. He has successfully sued a lot of badly behaved corporations, cornered the market in representing sacked rabbis, and acted for employees who were sacked for expressing political views. His articles and essays have appeared in Australia's major media outlets, and he is a contributing author to The Wages Crisis in Australia, What It Is and What to Do About It, published in 2018. He is a member of the Australia Institute's board and of the advisory board of the Centre for Employment and Labour Relations Law at the University of Melbourne. He is also a member of a sports disciplinary tribunal. Working for the Brand tells the story of how corporations are destroying free speech, weakening governments, undermining democracies, and repressing workers. Now, Josh, there's an idea that work is something you clock in, you do your hours, you clock out, get paid. But the employer-employee relationship has never been quite that simple. Could you take us through some of the history of, say, master-servant relations and that kind of thing?
Sure, it's true. The working relationship dates back to feudal times where workers were a form of property, if you like. And so since the notion of employment came along, there's been a battle between the notion of employment as a relationship between master and servant and the extent to which the master can regulate and control the lives of their servants. But during the second half of the 20th century in particular, as unions were stronger and politics was very different, workers began to obtain much more, I would argue, dignity at work and much more democratic forms of participation at work. And that's all been unravelled after 40 years of neoliberal transformation. So we're back in some ways to a feudal era in which, at least I argue, that a corporation now not only requires your work, but requires you to forego your right to participate fully in democracy, but also in some senses regulates your morals and behaviour both at work and outside work.
And what's the mechanism for this control? Is it contracts, corporate policies? How do they actually get that power?
It becomes a spider web, what I call a spider web, because it's very easy to be trapped in it. As the labour market's been deunionised, people have been left on employment contracts. When I started in my career, as an idealistic union lawyer, fighting to stop deunionisation, many people were governed by collective bargaining agreements, but over time we lost. And I observed as that decline happened, that process happened, the terms of individual employment contracts that appeared and still appear every week on my desk and how they changed. And they became more and more repressive. And an employment contract now, this is probably a good way to answer your question, will say, you agree, all of these are the same. And it's a reflection of the imbalance in bargaining power that there's nothing individual about an individual employment contract. They're all template documents. No one really negotiates them. Even at the higher echelons, it's hard to negotiate and get anywhere. So they're all pretty much the same. They'll say, you agree to abide by all our policies as varied from time to time. It might also say, for example, you agree to work in this position or any other position we decide you should work in, provided it meets your skills. So, and it may also throw in reference to a code of conduct. Most people, when they sign those things, haven't seen any of the policies and may never see them. But what's buried in the fine print is you end up agreeing to comply at all times, both at work and outside work, with what are called company values. And they tend to be honesty, integrity, respect, fairness, decency, and so on. Very aspirational, good things, but very broad and wide-ranging, particularly outside work. And so the net effect of all of that is, if you say or do anything that is controversial, particularly outside work, and someone puts it on the internet and generates a mob, as is very common these days, that will be enough for the company to go into crisis in brand management mode and either discipline or sack you often for example, breaching a term which says you didn't afford respect. You didn't put a tweet out that was respectful. It might be a joke. It might be something attacking Anzac Day, but it's very easy to be caught in the spider web. There's another term that's very commonly used, which people might be familiar with, which is you're not allowed to do anything or say anything to bring us into disrepute. And if I said to the head of BHP, what does that mean, or Telstra or Qantas, they wouldn't be able to give me the same answer. No one knows what that means. And so you're requiring an employee to commit to a set of rules, the boundaries of which are completely unclear.
Technology and the internet in particular seems to play a part in this spider web, unlike what we've seen before. I'm wondering where you think culpability lies between a public that might be part of a social media pylon and the corporation that responds to that public pressure by disciplining an employee.
Yeah, so what I explain in the book is, as corporations' behaviour deteriorated through the neoliberal transformation, branding and brand management grew in more importance. Naomi Klein first, I think, highlighted how brands moved from flogging jeans or products and commodities to become lifestyles, to become something much more ethereal. And more recently, as the online world exploded and started to change our culture, brands started to try and align themselves with progressive online movements to show that, that they were responsible citizens. I call this a form of ethics washing, because the same brands that, like Qantas, which Alan Joyce said he was a social justice CEO. At the time he was a social justice CEO, he sacked about 40% of the full-time workforce and replaced them with much cheaper, precarious labour. He set about making sure no old planes were replaced, because that would cost the company and shareholders too much money. So he downgraded the service and sold tickets to non-existent flights, and then set about making it impossible for people to redeem cancelled flights in COVID. But all the while, he was a quote-unquote social justice CEO. He's very emblematic of what I think is the Second Gilded Age. He's a character out of the Second Gilded Age, where corporations present themselves as deeply moral, responsible citizens as a mask and as a ruse to prevent proper regulation and to try and maintain a social license.
Is the problem with the mask or the brand? In a sense, if these corporations weren't hypocritical
Yeah.
and genuinely pursued social justice goals, would it be fair, firstly, for them to hold their employees to a higher standard, and also for consumers to genuinely prefer them?
This is a critical issue for me, because the notion of corporations being a vessel of morality is just quite disturbing. However, I say that, and I can hear some sympathetic laughter, but for people under 40, it's a real struggle. It's a real struggle, because unfortunately some of the propaganda and brand washing, the Kool-Aid has been consumed. There are many people who go to work and think they're going to work to align with a company that has the same values as they do, and will, vigorously participate in corporate activities that are often not about economic justice, but might be about social justice. They'll never be a corporate cupcake, tea and biscuits event for raising corporate tax. There won't be one of those. There won't be one about trying to increase union density. There might be some about climate change, maybe celebrating the latest purchase of the rolled gold carbon credits that the company has bought. But corporations, in my view, are not a vessel for moral issues. And in a sense, perhaps I'm arguing for a regressive position. They need to stay in their lane. They're a profit-seeking missile, effectively. And after that, moral issues and regulation really are for us and the governments we elect to determine. But the whole notion that they have values, there's a whole industry now of consultants, of business schools, branding and marketing people who promulgate the notion of corporate values. A company can't have values. Values are intrinsically human. People in corporations have wildly different values, and a corporation's role is to maximize profit, so that any ethical issue which clashes with the need to maximize profit will be subjugated. And so I'm trying to highlight to people, perhaps against the weight of public opinion, that we need to throw out the Kool-Aid, start identifying that these companies have become extremely large, monopolistic and harmful, and start to discover what it means to regulate them again properly.
Well, large, monopolistic and harmful might be a good segue to the large tech companies,
Yep.
Facebook, Twitter, or X as it's called, that are firstly the source of some of these pylons to workers that we've seen. And secondly, I guess, by your logic, can't be trusted to self-regulate. What's the kind of role that the government might play in limiting their harmful influence?
So first thing to note is no corporation should be trusted to self-regulate. If a corporation is meant to maximize profit, that means it will invariably sometimes veer towards unethical, improper and illegal conduct. And I don't need to, the book is littered with corporations who've won corporate social responsibility medals and awards, and have engaged in the most egregiously harmful conduct almost at the same time. But the issue with the 21st century is the neoliberal era produced globalization, technology, increase the reach and power of these corporations, and at the pinnacle of that power now are big tech companies, monopolies, which are completely out of control and engaged in all sorts of harmful behaviour that Australia and other governments and it's a project in Europe to try and manage and address the harm that's being caused. But they're essentially way too big and powerful. And in the First Gilded Age, Teddy Roosevelt had the same problem, a US Republican president who's probably my greatest political hero. And he was then dealing with monopolies in the US, not so much multinational monopolies, but he recognised the terrible harm that was being done in all sorts of ways, including very familiar harm that we see now, which is when you have monopolies and the robber barons that run them, you tend to have inequality increase, the state undermined, small business undermined, the interests of workers undermined, consumers get screwed over as well. And he set about breaking up those big monopolies in what is known as antitrust. In America, breaking up monopolies is an antitrust activity. And that's a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed in the 21st century. And the tragedy of the recent American election result is that although Joe Biden was very quiet about it, he was actually quite radically promoting trust busting in America with Lena Khan at the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, and the Department of Justice instigating a whole range of cases to break up companies, including big tech. The issue that I raise in the book, and which is now even more urgent than ever, is are these companies now too big to break up because they are so powerful, so wealthy, they can drag out any legal processes for possibly decades. The one thing that's going on in Australia at the moment that has the potential to be a game changer with big technology companies, including Twitter, is the notion of a duty of care. For people in the employment and industrial relations, seeing the duty of care is probably familiar territory. Lawyers refer to it all the time. It's a critical part of regulation of workplaces, of public spaces. And I've always thought, and occasionally penned an article saying we need to apply that lens to big technology companies, to apply a duty of care that they have to their users so that they will pay for the harm that results from their failure to fulfill their duty of care. Now, once you do that, you invert the business model of those companies. At the moment, those companies make a mozza from harmful content that galvanizes a lot of eyeballs, disinformation, conspiracy theories, a range of other content that gets the most clicks, gives them the most income. So their profit incentive is intricately tied up with harm. We need to completely reverse it. Once they have to pay for the harm that they cause, they will reverse gear. So it's the most important type of reform that you could consider to try and tame big tech if we can. And for the first time, I've heard it. I don't know whether there's people here who can actually fill me in, but the Albanese government is talking about imposing a duty of care. The Minister has recently, the Minister for Communications has recently flagged it. What sort of duty of care, how it's going to work, I haven't heard.
I'm interested in this First Gilded Age, Second Gilded Age metaphor, but I have to admit my history is pretty weak on this. Could you tell us a bit more about kind of time and place for the First Gilded Age, and apart from large monopolies, what else is similar with today?
The First Gilded Age was also known as the Belle Epoque in in France, basically, I think relates to the period from the late 1890s into the beginning of the 20th century. And in the US in particular, which is the subject of a lot of focus on the history of the Gilded Age, it was a boom time for big steel companies, big railway companies, big energy companies who used any means necessary to develop monopoly power. And at that time, there were no real regulations about workplace safety. So if you were in an abattoir in a part of the US and you lost your arm in an accident, you just got sacked. And interestingly, it was also an era in which there were media, what was known as yellow journalism flourished. Media outlets which were toxic, partisan, sensationalized, used propaganda to try and generate sales. And the situation economically produced great wealth for a relative few and then great harm to many others, a lot of political instability. And it was in that era that Teddy Roosevelt came to power in the early 1900s. He was a Republican and recognised that the big monopolies had bought off, were basically sponsoring a lot of his Republican colleagues. And so he had an enormous political challenge to try and convince Republicans to support what he thought was necessary to tame the power of big business. He argued big business is a creation of the state. We confer enormous benefits on business and privileges on business, and business has to be regulated by the state, not undermine and decimate the state. He was a very powerful orator, an amazing character. That was also the time when the first investigative journalists appeared at a magazine called McClure's Magazine. And at a time when in the media there was quite a lot of concern and in the polity about yellow journalism, a bit like there is about the Murdoch press now. And so what Roosevelt did to try and manage his internal political challenge with Republicans on the payroll of big business was to partner with those investigative journalists who, in the days when journalism was very different, which will make any journalist in this audience cry, were sent out on 6-month assignments, funded to go and produce a 10,000-word essay on what's going on in abattoirs, for example, or how monopolies are crushing competitors in steelworks. And so there was basically Roosevelt used the exposés produced by the journalists to shame his Republican colleagues and to start to introduce laws for breaking up monopolies, for compelling companies to pay tax, for workers' safety. And interestingly, he was one of the early environmentalists. So he's an amazing cat, and he designated various parts of the US national parks, and he was a conservationist. And so that was his amazing challenge and his amazing legacy, and it continued basically throughout the 20th century. The struggle in the relationship between the corporation and government has waxed and waned. It fell apart leading up to the Great Depression. FDR came in with a New Deal and set about a new model. But since FDR, in many ways, things have gone backwards.
I want to pull on a thread from earlier about kind of corporate control over workers. It might kind of seem from the book and the subtitle how corporations are destroying free speech that you'd be a free speech absolutist. You hinted at the idea that these are democratic decisions rather than corporate decisions. And in particular, people might remember a few years ago you took a position on Israel Folau that was quite different from a lot on the progressive left. Could you take us through that moment, but also what that says about your view on free speech more generally?
Yeah. So I'm far from a free speech absolutist. Speech, the very frustrating thing about many debates about free speech is often people start from the proposition that speech is free and always has been, and we want the good old days. Free speech has never purely existed. There's always been regulation of speech that harms, and I'm a believer in many restrictions on speech that's harmful. For example, you can't in business rip people off by engaging in a deceptive and misleading speech. You can't lie about the product and say, this doesn't have asbestos when it does, to use a very obvious example. Sexual harassment laws regulate speech. Bullying laws regulate speech. Copyright does. Defamation does. There's the range of speech that is regulated is quite significant in many democracies. The distinction that I make, and which became fairly stark in the Israel Folau case, is these issues about what speech is harmful and where it crosses the Rubicon, where it needs to be regulated, are difficult and require careful deliberation and input from all sorts of, I hate the word, stakeholders. Sorry to use a corporate piece of flim-flam, but people affected need to have input into those sorts of decisions. We saw that when the debate about 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act was very contentious. Everybody had a go. I'm all in favour of that because what it produces is some form of democratic deliberation and an outcome. Contrast that with Israel Folau or a lot of the other cases I draw attention to. Someone says or does something controversial, online mob forms, tags the employer. The statement may have nothing to do with the employment, often doesn't. The reason they're tagging the employer is, I think, it's a bad faith exercise in trying to punish someone you disagree with or an ideological foe by getting them sacked or disciplined. So in Israel Folau's case, homophobic quote from the Bible. He goes to a church which preaches homophobia. The comments he made were ridiculous, but we support as a state his right to go to that church. We support that church. We also have a law that says you're entitled to be protected from being sacked because of your religion. And then on the other hand, he has freedom of religion enshrined in legislation. And on the other hand, many of us, including me, believe that the queer community should be free from vilification. But at the time, and I still think it's the case, there wasn't a federal law protecting the queer community in the same way. But in any event, you've got a contest between different rights, the right to religious affiliation and the right to live free of vilification as a person with dignity in the community. That is a clash, complex clash, morally, philosophically, legally. Who do I want to try and address that? I don't want Qantas to be doing that. I don't want BHP, and I don't want the NRL to be doing that because they have absolutely no democratic mandate. And so that's why I intervened. The other thing that disturbed me about that debate was Many progressives, I count myself as a strong progressive, who disagreed with me and condemned Folau, didn't say anything about harm. They didn't say you should sack him because he's harming the queer community or is endangering young queer lives. They said sack him because he's breached the social media policy in his contract of employment. And I could cry, because you apply the same logic of that, you undermine important labour rights, but most of the people who get sacked, most dissidents, people who disturb the status quo, are progressive. So to use the flip side, I acted for Ros Ward, a academic at La Trobe University who posted a rainbow flag. She's a queer Marxist. And boom, it goes off in the pages of The Australian and online, campaign. Then she faces serious misconduct charges at La Trobe University. Right? Absolutely. At the time, I just went to work and made sure they didn't sack her. But now I look back and how did that ever happen? What serious misconduct in any workplace is the worst of the worst? It's, like repeated sexual harassment, fraud, theft, really at the extreme. Posting a rainbow flag in your spare time on Facebook to your friends and making a joke, which she did. If this flag ever come, this is my dream flag. Once it's in place, my work is done. A wry quip. And that was serious misconduct. It's insane. So I intervened in that debate for all those reasons, and for my sins got a lot of blowback from people in the progressive community, but I also got support, including from people in the queer community, and who still come up to me and say, good on you. And I just wish I'd known they had the same view at the time, because I might have enlisted their support as well in that debate. It remains unresolved, because the issue about what do you do about homophobic religion and the rights of people not to live with homophobia is terrifyingly difficult for politicians. And so people who may disagree with me may say, actually, the politicians don't have the guts to deal with it. So in the absence of that, a corporation should be able to deal with it. I don't agree, and I just think a corporation will ultimately determine its position based on brand management, maximisation of profit. And that's causing a lot of harm in the workplace, and it now wields a power that no democratic government would ever dream of wielding, which is a power. It's not possible to envisage, I don't think, even in your worst nightmare, a federal government in Australia saying there's a law now that requires you as citizens not to say or do anything that brings Australia into disrepute. And we all say, what does that mean? And the answer will be, we'll tell you afterwards, because until then we won't know.
With the Israel Folau case, there were kind of fair weather friends on the right standing up for free speech. And I think in general, the right has claimed free speech as an issue in a way that the left has not. Do you think that's reflects true kind of deep-seated principled positions on both sides?
Absolutely not. I mean, I criticise in the book, after lots of agonising, I criticise the left over the way it prosecutes identity politics, particularly in universities and in the arts. And I did that after careful consideration. But the most repressive force in our society, the most authoritarian force in our society, is the right. You've got, the Murdoch press, when it combines with conservative politicians in a pylon, make university pylons look like a walk through the daisies. Look at what happened to Yasmin Abdel-Majid, who tweeted 5 or 7 words about Anzac Day, deleted the tweet and apologised 2 minutes later, and then was the subject of an evisceration that forced her offshore. The left can't compete with that. The right also uses violence. So to silence opposition and speech. Think of the massacre in New Zealand. Think of massacres in the US at synagogues or in black churches. Think of what's happened to scientists. One of the things that gets my blood pressure extremely, in an extremely bad way, is I still get very upset about what's happened to Anthony Fauci, who during COVID was a force for good and sanity and rationality. The Republicans then started to campaign against him. Elon Musk started to campaign against him. He then suffered enormous death threats. His family suffered death threats. He's since quit, but his family and he are still under 24/7 protection, which there's just no equivalent in left-wing cancel culture. The other thing the right does is when right-wing governments and the Murdoch press combine, they can silence or change the speech of the public broadcaster, the ABC. It's much more systematic. Universities, they've silenced the CSIRO effectively on climate change for the last 10 or 15 years. The Bureau of Meteorology as well. They have diminished the voice of trade unions extraordinarily. They've silenced charities. They've silenced community legal centres. Their form of cancel culture is far more systematic and methodical. They can do the online targeting again fiercely and in many ways far more effectively than the left do. But a lot of what their censorship is not called cancel culture. Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. But a lot of what they do is not called cancel culture, but they're far more effective. And the other thing I was going to say is, all the while, the right proclaims to be the force for free speech. It's a fraud. It's a complete fraud. Now it's happened to you.
I've got one more question which builds on this idea of hypocrisy, but then we'll have time for audience questions. So if people want to start lining up here to get ready to ask your questions, we'll go to you just after this one, which is, I guess, the book opens with these examples of hypocrisy around free speech and cancel culture, people who complain about cancel culture and then try to get their own critics fired. But the more I read, the more I worried I was a hypocrite on these issues as well, inconsistent with how I thought free speech and regulated speech should play out. I was wondering if you had suggestions for the audience here and also for readers of the book about how they can be more intellectually consistent themselves and spot themselves falling into this trap.
I mean, I think it's really difficult to go through life without being at some point a hypocrite about free speech, because it's a very complex area which I wrestled with. So I think reading about, I've ended up in a position where, as a raging lefty, I've adopted a position which is a liberal, democratic free speech perspective. And one of the ways I've done is just try and challenge myself. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? In the law, when I started out, I didn't think about that. I was a crusader for my clients and I didn't think about what if I'm wrong, but that's not a very good way to practice law. And I discovered that thankfully early and started to question my thinking. And so I do that with the free speech argument. The one thing that that gives me a bit of hope about the left is the recent horror that's unleashed in the Middle East, in Gaza, and before that in Israel, has seen the progressive left completely backflip on its previous position about shutting down speech where a person felt unsafe or where microaggressions were used. The right has also flipped. The right, 10 years ago, tried to weaken racial vilification laws, so on the basis that people had a right to be a bigot. Now the Australian fiercely supports stronger laws against anti-Semitism, and so does Peter Dutton. The left, at least those people who are protesting about what's happening in Gaza, also have flipped and now say, you don't have a right to feel safe. We can engage in microaggressions and we can go much further than that. What I hope, and I may be wildly optimistic, that at least gets some of the left reflecting about trying to take a more consistent position that protects speech, recognises not only government can be a problem, but actually corporations are now suppressing speech far more radically in many ways than government is, and then starts to do something about it.
Thank you, Josh. We can go to audience now.
Thank you. Back to corporations or companies. They only exist because we allow them to exist.
Yep.
We've set up companies legislation, which is enormously complicated. And there's good economic reasons for them to exist.
Yes.
But when they get out of control, there's very bad social outcomes. Companies are controlled by directors, absolutely and totally controlled by directors. Companies have should be operating within a social license. Why don't we do more about pursuing the directors? Joyce supposedly got punished for what he did, but I'd really love to have the punishment that he got. But there's no word about the directors. They appointed him. They authorised every single decision he made. And I just use him as an example. There's plenty more, obviously. What can we do to the company's legislation that targets the directors and sends them to jail? Because fining someone $1 million who earned $12 million last year doesn't cut it. What can we do about that?
We can discover the lost art of regulation. So neoliberalism changed the relationship between corporations and the state and essentially undermined the role of the state. And neoliberal theorists actively argued for monopoly power. Bork, in the famous writer called Bork, argued that monopolies are just the product of the efficiency of the market because they will produce better outcomes for consumers and everybody else. Regulation stopped. Regulation dwindled. Regulation, I think, in Australia is a debacle, absolute debacle. And particularly in corporation land, the only signs of life, I think, are in the ACCC, and that's recent. So what you posit is really just a subset of that same challenge. There's a US writer, Matt Stoller, who's an antitrust warrior, who talks about how the Democratic Party engage in learned helplessness about corporate regulation. But I think that's a much broader malaise. And I think neoliberal politics which is supposed to be dead, but continues to haunt us, is still infecting our capacity to deter unlawful conduct and start to tame the power of corporations. So that's my best answer. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is to highlight that issue and to say, here's the harm that's been caused. These, as you say, these are creatures of us. They're creatures of the state. They only exist because of the state. So we can decide how much harm they cause, and it's a question for us and those who believe in robust regulation.
Hi. With conflicting rights across people, what are your thoughts on the role and need for a Bill of Rights?
I would love a Bill of Rights, but like anything that speaks to our higher selves, our politics at the moment, The Voice was the most recent attempt at something which is principled and decent, and a Bill of Rights would be in that realm. And so that would be fantastic, but I'm just deeply pessimistic about anything like that, given the current political climate. I don't know whether you think it's likely, but I just can't see it happening. The current government's very cautious, technocratic. I can't see it going into bat for something as big as a Bill of Rights. Sorry.
So the tension between capital and labour is an inherent feature of capitalism.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if it's actually necessary, whether we can imagine a future that's different to that, for example, through employee share schemes or even worker cooperatives.
Yeah.
And so instead of working for the brand, we work for each other.
Yep. So that's, again, a more idealistic proposition. The question was, there's an inherent tension between capital and labour, but there are other models by which we can work and collaborate together, including employee share schemes or share ownership schemes and cooperatives. And do I support that sort of approach? Again, I'm probably jaundiced. Those forms of economic participation have existed for a long time, but they don't seem to be thriving or posing any challenge to the dominance of corporations. So I'm still probably more conservative in the sense that what I argue for is a much bigger role and dynamic role for the state. Some state ownership, some private ownership. I would love cooperatives to be thriving and other forms of economic activity and social activity as well. But fundamentally, the most democratic challenge is to give the state the teeth and the power to stop what's currently going on with out-of-control corporations. So that's the main challenge. I don't know whether those other forms of participation will thrive. I hope I'm wrong, but again, it's a bit like the previous question. Ooh.
What role do you see the free trade agreements playing in this corporate government regulation?
I'm not an expert on free trade agreements, but free trade agreements tend to subvert the rights of consumers and workers, and I think are in many ways anti-democratic. They've also, I think, been a part of neoliberalism, which has done a lot of harm politically and destabilised and undermined democracies. So while I'm not an expert, I'm very, very wary of them and their terms, which in some cases seek to prevent or protect corporations from legal cases and class actions if they behave badly. There may be a progressive free trade agreement that can be notched, but I'm yet to see one.
Josh, there was a reporter that sent 4 emails to the police in the South Coast, and he was charged with harassment. My partner received multiple emails or vilified on social media to an extent. She was a founder of a charity. She was, which caused her incredible harm psychologically, which caused her to take her own life. The application of the law is a mess, and I'd just like your opinion on how do we get this right so that it can't just be applied for one and not for the other?
We have to identify the harm, understand the harm. I'm very sorry to hear that terrible story, which is why I've tried to put corporations on trial in this book. And the second thing is we've got to move away from learned helplessness and to start to support strong, robust, dynamic regulation which tames them. This is exactly what happened during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. So in the situation you talk about, if someone is getting bombarded online with harmful conduct and their health is diminishing, which is notorious, one of the great beneficiaries of the digital age are psychologists and pharmaceutical companies, because we all end up in therapy or on some form of tablet to deal with the harm that's caused. If you have a legal avenue, if you can sue a company that keeps harming its workers, they'll eventually start reducing that. So you need a strong central regulator, and then you need individuals to be able to quickly seek redress for harm, or even seek an injunction to stop the harm happening proactively. The law develops these mechanisms. It can use them to stop environmental protesters. It can use them to stop hate campaigns that decimate people's health and sometimes lead to that sort of tragic outcome.
Yeah, you were talking about a lot about corporations, which I think is very justified. But I was wondering what you thought about like the public service and the limits on free speech if you are a public servant. And it sort of seemed like you were drawing the line before, and you can tell me that I'm wrong, that's fine, that you were drawing the line before a bit at like when it's a democratic decision to restrict your free speech versus when it's a profit motive that's restricting your free speech. And I guess that's the justification for public servants, is that it's in the public good for you to not be online and saying things that are political and giving your opinion on things. But I was wondering if that's a separate issue. Do you think
it's an excellent question, and it's a very deliberate decision in my book not to address that. One, it doesn't fit my argument because a lot of the restrictions on public servants are legislated through the parliament. But two, the more you move towards a public service, a public good, the more the argument becomes more complicated and difficult. So a judge, for example, I support judges not being restricted in overt political activities. In the US, it's a debacle. In Australia, it's a better system. I support that because a judge is part of a system in which we're supposed to have separation between the state and politics and the deliberations of the law. Public servants, I've got a lot of views about the restrictions on public servants, and many of them are capriciously and arbitrarily enforced. But I can see a legitimate argument that if you're there to serve the public, that might mean you need to be careful about taking an overt partisan political position on certain issues. There are oppressive cases, I think, but not to the same degree as occurs in the private sector, and there tends to be a better process for dealing with disputes than there is in the private sector, in which it's much more of a Wild West. So I think there are very live issues for public servants about the extent to which they should be restricted, but I can see at least an argument against me, which is about doing something for the public good and therefore accepting some constraints. I think they go too far.
Thank you so much, Josh, for this. And everyone, please thank Josh Bornstein for his time this evening. While you're applauding, please continue for Verity Lane Market, which has hosted us, and my wonderful colleagues Hayden, Eleanor, and Hannah for their help tonight. Before I let you all go, I'd like to let you know about some of the upcoming events we're hosting. So next Wednesday at this location, we'll be launching Australia Institute Press and our first book, What's the Big Idea? 32 Big Ideas for a Better Australia. This is to mark the Australia Institute's 30 years of big ideas. And we've asked some of our friends and leading thinkers from around Australia and the world to share a big idea for a better Australia. Richard Dennis, Amy Ramikis, Greg Jericho from the Australia Institute, and Kieran Pender from the Human Rights Law Centre will be hosted by co-editor Alice Grundy for a fun evening discussing big ideas that can change the world. And as light refreshments will be served, please RSVP to our invitation email, which should have gone out to those of you who are on our list today. So please join us here for that celebration, 6:30 p.m. next Wednesday here in the Louis room. Finally, we're selling Josh's new book, Working for the Brand, tonight. Book sales are over in the back corner, and Josh, I think, will be staying around to sign copies. So feel free to say hi to the staff at the tables and grab yourselves a book or two. Thank you again, everyone, for attending tonight's event, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.